right.
Maybe she's born with it.
Ahoy, mateys! Sorry for the lame setup. Hopefully I made up for it with that intro. Don't come for my potato can or its wig. So when it comes to kids transitioning, I know I'm gonna get a lot of flack for this, but I don't think it's this socially destructive, George Soros funded conspiracy to chemically castrate white children and prevent them from procreating later in life. Honestly, I think that's BS. I think people are blowing it way out of proportion. And at the end of the day, the actual people that should be concerned here aren't even being talked about at all. Since when does that light have a fan in it? Like, I feel like the best analogy is, do you remember that episode of America's Next Top Model where two girls got into the spat and then the whole house started fighting and was like split on either side? And everybody was yelling at each other except for the two girls who were concerned. It's exactly like that. At the end of the day, this whole backlash against children transitioning isn't really solving anything because it's leaving the actual issue out of the picture and really, I think, making it into something it's not. So when it comes to kids transitioning, the other thing is I can only really vouch for this from a trans woman perspective. I don't know too many trans men. And in fact, I feel like with female puberty, it's a lot safer to transition later because, you can always deepen your voice. You can always grow facial hair. You can always masculinize your appearance pretty convincingly, more or less, without surgery. But it's pretty much the exact opposite for trans women. You can't unbroaden your shoulders. You can't ungrow your hands. You can't undeepen your voice. So really the only logical solution, if you don't have a ton of money to get those things fixed with surgery, is to get on that bandwagon before they even happen. Obviously, when it comes to like little kids, like literal children, I'm not really pro putting them on like any medication like that. Like hell, I would even be skeptical if a little kid got put on Ritalin. But at the same time, I think if you're a 6-year-old boy, experimenting with more feminine clothes and really just being as flamboyant as your little prepubescent heart desires, I say go for it, because that was something that was largely kept from me when I was a kid, at least in public. And it absolutely crushed me. So for those of you who don't know, I actually came out as trans to my mom in late 2012. But the reason why we actually went forward with the transition was because I was such a feminine little kid that when I was 4 or 5, my parents actually took me to a gender specialist who actually, ironically, wound up transitioning to a woman like a decade later. And then back then, well, it would have been he, said, he'll probably just be gay, and keep it at home. So when I came out as trans again, it was very clear that this was a pattern. It had never gone away. And it wasn't just innocent child cross-dressing. And it wasn't just me being a flamboyant little kid. It was an actual thing. And the other thing is, because I'm autistic, I was always very just weird. So it was more dismissed as a personality thing or like an interest in girl stuff versus actually mentally being a girl. And the other thing with being autistic is I was able to express myself really young. Like, I knew being a guy wasn't right, but my parents were like, okay, you can do whatever you want at home, but like, you're going to get the crap kicked out of you at school. And that might have been true. This was the early 2000s. This was before Jazz Jennings. This was before Laverne Cox. Hell, this would have been within a decade of Laramie. So the whole anti-LGBT sentiment was still there. However, obviously times are changing, and I just don't want anyone to be left behind. Did I really just quote George Bush? And the other thing you also have to acknowledge is that transitioning is expensive, especially if you're a family or if you're a parent trying to pay for a kid's medical transition is insanely expensive. And that's not even counting surgery. I had to get the testosterone blocker injections, and those are 500 Canadian dollars every 28 days. But on that note, like I said, being Canadian, it was all covered. So that was also why I was able to transition quite young, was because obviously I had a very supportive family. That was never really the concern. And finances weren't ever really a concern either, because Canada. And that's the thing, is like, as far as trans acceptance goes, I would even go as far as saying that the climate here is very different than that of the United States. So really just keep in mind that no matter how American I might sound, or even if we speak the language, at the end of the day, I am from a different country. And things are very different here. And I feel like the reason I'm more touchy about kids transitioning is I know that if I had waited any longer, I would be fucked. And the reason I know that now is, I mean, I always knew I would be big and hairy like my dad with a really deep voice. And I would not be able to transition out of that. Had I gone through puberty and turned into someone like my dad, I probably would have shot myself. For those of you who don't know, I have a brother who's 2 years younger than me, and watching him grow up, he's not a little boy anymore. His voice is extremely deep. He's big, he's bulky, and I would not be able to transition nearly as well as I have had I had that as my starting point. I know some males grow up to be 5'4". I know some males grow up to have high voices, not really any facial hair, and that's great, but that is not that common. And that's what people say is like, oh, you should wait until you're old enough to make that decision. Being that old is too late for most people. And so for those of you who don't know, trans women usually are prescribed testosterone blockers. And if puberty is ongoing, it halts it there. And should they change their mind and decide not to transition, they go off the blockers, their body basically reboots, and male puberty resumes exactly where it left off. I mean, even then, I'm 5'8", I have long legs, and if everything else about me was masculine and I was tall, I wouldn't have a chance. Now, the other thing, and this is mostly in my experience, so there's a point of no return with puberty, with your skeletal growth and development and stuff like that. And after this point of no return, once again, I think this is just for trans women, but your bones are set in their destiny, and they will grow into a male skeleton, regardless if you've been on blockers or not, because they already know that's their destiny, and they'll keep growing into that form. However, until that point of no return, the bones are pretty plastic, and I went on blockers before this point of no return. So when I went on estrogen several years later, my bones actually grew into the same form that they would have had I been born a cis woman. I literally developed actual birthing hips. That's not just fat distribution, that's like actual bone growth. And I got so lucky to go on blockers when I did, because like I said, had I not done that, had I not transitioned super young, I honestly probably wouldn't even be alive right now. Because, I wouldn't want to spend $30,000 unnecessarily dollars fixing my face, or being unable to speak for months on end because I got my voice box done. Because, I'm literally 18 years old. I've got bills to pay. I've got college to save up for. I don't have $30,000 to, do any of that. And to be honest, in this economy, I probably never will. Oh, and there's the fan again. It's okay. I love my fans. So basically, I went on blockers right after I turned 13. So I went full-time at a new school in a new city with my name change in the works, and I was stealth at this point. Keep that in mind. So, but I remember there was this conspiracy going around that I was trans because I had a really deep voice for a 13-year-old. But now that I'm, 18 and I'm also, tall, having a deep, raspy voice isn't really inappropriate. But, what if I was in the same situation years later where I was 25 but sounded like a 25-year-old man, and people were conspiring that I was trans just because of my deep voice? I know how that feels, and It's horrible. And that's the whole thing, is transitioning young saved my ass. And just knowing that quite literally saved my life from being immeasurably worse, it just really pains me to think that people would consciously be withholding that from other people. I just think that's cruel to, sit and watch yourself develop into someone you don't recognize. It's torture. So I'm not going to say people who don't support kids transitioning are supporting child torture, but like, it is. Like I said, I'm not shading anyone in particular, but when people come to me talking about how against children transitioning they are, and how I'm like the only sane trans person they've ever seen, and I'm just kind of expected to sit there and be like, yeah, okay, we stan. We don't stan. So let me know what you guys think in the comments. But like I said, people come for children transitioning not knowing that, I was one of those kids and it worked out really well for me. And I'm not saying that it will work out well for everyone. I'm not saying that kids should go on hormones. What I am saying is that buying someone a little bit of time can wind up saving their life later on. Anyways, y'all, that is it for this video. But before I go, just one quick update. I am getting the snip on June 11th. So if I'm not as active or not posting as often, I mean, it's not like I posted often anyways. That's why, because I'm going to be out of commission for a minute. So I'll see you around. Enjoy your life. XOXO, Gossip Girl. I'll take my Grammys now, thank you. TERFs can suck my dick while it's still around. Okay, do you want to see my Billie Eilish Instagram impression?